Wherever we look, there seems to be endless reasons to feel anxious in today's world. From natural disasters to mass shootings to tensions in North Korea to the flu. It's no wonder that an estimated 40 million Americans are currently suffering from anxiety. On the high end of the spectrum are panic attacks, debilitating fear, and free-floating anxiety. On the low end are the normal fears and anxieties that we all experience from time to time. Regardless of where your overall anxiety level might currently be, the perspective that my guest today, Corinne Zupko, has to offer for undoing anxiety-based thinking is sure to come in handy in these uncertain times. Corinne knows anxiety intimately. Her first anxiety disorder diagnosis happened at the age of 2, and it was her determination to alleviate the symptoms of her own debilitating anxiety that ultimately inspired her to begin studying A Course in Miracles, which is at the heart of the perception shifting process we'll be discussing today. Corinne's new book, From Anxiety to Love, A Radical New Approach for Letting Go of Fear and Finding Lasting Peace, is currently making its way onto bookstore shelves around the world. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to connect with her today. So welcome, Corinne, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kim. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here.
Yay. Why don't we start by having you talk a little bit about your personal journey with anxiety and what it was like before you started applying the ideas that you're going to share with us today?
Yeah, so you mentioned that statistic about 40 million Americans, and I really think that that's actually a low number because, like you said, with that spectrum, we fall all in that spectrum of high anxiety to just the everyday sorts of fears and concerns. And I lived on that high end of the spectrum for most of my life. I would be terrified. You mentioned the flu. Health triggers were probably my greatest trigger for anxiety. I really, my gosh, Ebola, SARS, whatever the latest disease was, I would just be obsessively worrying about it. And it resulted in an ulcer at the age of 12. It resulted in periods of time when I would just be absolutely incapacitated by anxiety. And it really shrunk my world. It limited what I would do. I didn't want to travel. I didn't want to get on planes. I really didn't want to leave my safe space. And when the anxiety was really acute, when it was really overwhelming, there's really no words that I have to convey to somebody else what the experience of a panic attack is like. They're almost violent. They're overwhelmingly scary. You don't know what's happening. You feel like your heart is just going to burst and that your death is just imminent, that it's next. So it's not a fun way to live. And I really, when things got interesting for me, and I say interesting, meaning I broke down with panic attacks when I was in college being the age that mental health issues surface for a lot of people, I just knew I had to find a better way because I had done many different types of approaches to try to work with my anxiety, but nothing really got deep enough to help me sort of uncover where that anxiety was coming from. I really wanted something that sort of helped me to dig into my own mind and really look at where these fears were coming from and what I could do about them, because it's not a fun place to be, not at all.
Yeah, definitely not. I've only had one panic attack in my life, and it was memorable and not very much fun. That's for sure.
They're definitely memorable. That's for sure.
Yes. And as I mentioned in the intro, the perspective that you offer in From Anxiety to Love is largely based on A Course in Miracles. So can you tell us how that book first came into your life and briefly explain what the course is for those who might not know?
Absolutely. So my mom, bless her heart, she has always been a spiritual person, and she found A Course in Miracles years before I started having panic attacks. And she'd say, Corinne, you should try this thing that I'm studying. It's called A Course in Miracles. And I'd literally do one of these where I'd put my hands over my ears. La, 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 la. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in this spiritual crap. And it wasn't until I was completely desperate in my my first sort of round of panic attacks that I would try anything. So she offered the book to me. And when she said she really thought that it could help my level of anxiety, I said, I will try anything. So that was 1997. It was a while ago. I've never put the book down. It's a book. A Course in Miracles is a spiritual, metaphysical text.
Big book.
A big book. Yeah. It's funny. I was speaking with somebody who wanted to dive into it for the first time. And she said, oh, I heard it's a hard read, but I was an English major. I'll be fine. And I was like, okay, good luck. Let me know how it goes. And she came back and she was like, English major, forget it. This book is not an easy read at all. And it's divided into 3 parts. So there's a text, a workbook, which has a lesson or a meditation for every day of the year. So there's 365 of them. And then a manual for teachers in the back. And I always recommend folks to start with either the manual or the workbook, because the manual is written in a much more digestible way where you can sort of really begin to grasp what it's teaching. The text is very theoretical and it's very dense, so it can be really hard to grasp initially what it's saying. But I first opened up the cover of that book. The first thing that I read was, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And I literally went, huh? But something stirred in my heart. Something spoke to me. This little glimmering of peace, of hope, of love came up in me. And that motivated me to keep going. That motivated me to keep reading and studying. And even though I didn't understand a lot of what I read, the things that I did understand really started to help me. I really started feeling like this was going to bring me deep where I needed to go to start to heal.
Yes. Yeah. I actually bought and read A Course in Miracles myself after I read Marianne Williamson's A Return to Love. And I'm so grateful that there's books like yours and also Maria Felipe's book, who I had on the podcast, Live Your Happy, that kind of take the ideas and present it in such a way that's easier to understand. It's good stuff. And it's nice to have almost like cliff notes on how to deal with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in your book, you say that in order to wake up from the nightmare of anxiety, that we have to recognize that it is a nightmare. So you explain what you mean by that.
We have to recognize that we want another way. Ask yourself right now, in all areas of your life, is it working for you? Is your thought system working for you? And chances are we're going to find places in our life where it's not, where things just don't seem to be working. And so this pathway of the Course is prompting us to look deeply at even the benefits that we get out of negative states. So going with your question, we have to look at the fact that sometimes we can get really comfortable in our pain. Our pain becomes very familiar. It becomes very comfortable. We might even get benefits out of certain painful states. For instance, when I was up until high school, I was sick all the time. And there were many times in high school when I didn't want to do something that my friends were doing, and I'd use sickness as an excuse. So there was a positive to me staying sick. It got me out of things I didn't want to do. When I realized that I was doing that, I thought, yikes, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just going to learn how to say no. And I was able to let go of using sickness all the time to get out of things and just say no instead. So we have to look at, with fear, with anxiety, where do we think it's protecting us? Where do we think it's keeping us safe? What benefits are we getting out of our maybe things, our areas of life that we would like to let go, and get radically honest about those with yourself and be willing to be open to a shift.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this quote from the book because it so succinctly describes the process that you and A Course in Miracles offers, which is waking up from the dream of anxiety is a gentle, gradual, and loving process. To move from anxiety to love, we have to learn to distinguish between the two voices of our mind, the voice of love and the voice of fear, and choose the voice we want to listen to. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of look at each of those voices individually first. And let's start with the voice that tends to be the one we're most familiar with, and the voice of the ego.
Yeah, that voice of the ego we know well. And we can think about the ego as that voice of fear in our minds. It's the belief that we are separate from eternal love. It's a belief that we're separate from one another. So the voice of fear, my goodness, it's judgment, It's negative self-talk. It's judgments towards ourselves, towards others. It's all those fears that tell us, no, you're not safe if you do that. Don't do this. Don't do that. I have to provide for myself. I need to, save enough or have a big enough house, and then I'll be happy. That's the voice of fear. That's the voice of the ego, and we know it well. The voice of the ego is really what drives a lot of the world and a lot of pain in the world. A lot of decisions, a lot of politics, a lot of interactions with others, even strangers at times, are guided by fear instead of love. So the flip side is the voice of love. This is a voice that exists within every single one of us, but it's quiet. It's still. It's wholly loving, and it tells us of our complete safety, our complete innocence, and it tells us of the fact that we can trust love. We can trust our brothers, our sisters. We can trust one another because this voice of love exists within every single one of us. And as I get in touch with that voice of love within me, I can see it in another person. I can join with another person in that space of love rather than in that space of fear. So the voice of love can be a quiet voice. There's a quote in the Course that says, the ego always speaks first and loudest. But the voice of love always answers. In other words, when we ask for guidance, when we ask for that voice of love to know it, the answer is immediately given. We have to learn how to listen and how to pay attention to that voice of love.
Yeah. And I had never thought about anxiety in terms of the voice of ego before I read your book. And I think it's interesting, and it makes perfect sense that you say that anxiety is a great indicator of how closely we're identified with the ego. And if we're feeling anxious, we can be sure that we're lost in ego.
Yes, 100%. In my experience, the ego, the fearful thought system, uses anxiety as bait because it knows I'll take it. So in other words, we were mentioning the flu before. Throw out the flu or whatever your greatest anxiety trigger is. I came to see that as bait that the ego would sort of dangle in front of me saying, oh, you're gonna take it? Like, come on, let's play this game of fear. And that's then getting lost in that anxiety is just the ego having a heyday. And it's again about deciding to say, you know what, I'm going to choose to not take that bait this time. Or at minimum, I'm willing to not take the bait this time. Show me another way, asking that voice of love to show you another way.
Yeah. In the foreword to your book, Dr. Robert Rosenthal says that anxiety is nothing more than fear projected into the future, fear about what might occur at some future time, and love is lived only in present tense, which I really loved. That love's always in the present moment, and it goes back to so much of the books that New World Library publishes, and that's where we're trying to be, and that makes great sense. So it really seems like it's a moment-to-moment thing of distinguishing between those two voices. So how do we make room for that, begin to make room for the voice of love so that we're actually listening to it?
That's a great question in terms of making room for that voice. I want to highlight what you just said. This is a moment-to-moment practice. I used to use the Course as almost a Band-Aid where I'd feel better. I'd have that moment of feeling better. Then I'd put it down and forget about the voice of love and go on my merry way. And what would happen? But I'd sort of fall again. It is a moment-to-moment practice. And one of the greatest ways that we can make room for that voice is through our willingness, is through our moment-to-moment choice to come into a place of being willing to listen to the voice of love. Just that tiny willingness is all that we need to make that space. Another way of making that space, once we're willing, is to get quiet as we can. In my head, the ego voice is incessant. It's like that Charlie Brown, wah, 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 constantly, jibber jabbering. And I had to learn to be able to pause, even if it's just for one breath, even if it's just for one moment, coming back into the now, coming back into this moment. Because yes, absolutely, love abides in this moment. This is the only place where it exists. And so even a very practical tool with just pausing and taking one deep breath in and out can help shift our mind back to love, back to the now moment.
I really like the exercise that you offered in the book about thought swapping, because I think, it's easy to know what the ego's thinking and what we're upset about and judgments we have. And I think just taking a moment to say, okay, what would love say right now? And just like, so you can have both of them, was just that seems like it's such a powerful way to do it.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up, because part of now I've been through all sorts of therapy, like we were sort of hinting at before. I was looking for something that would really get down and deep. And I'm a licensed counselor also. So I know all the therapeutic approaches, and one of which is disputing your irrational thoughts and changing them, coming up with a more positive thought. And there's definitely benefit to that. But with this approach that I write about with thought swapping, we don't even have to fix our negative or our anxious thoughts. We literally just have to see them and offer them over. And the voice of love gives us a new thought to replace it with. It's an exchange. So we're not even losing a negative thought. We're gaining, it's an exchange. We're gaining back an experience of the love that we are. And it's that experience that teaches us that we are made of love, that we are literally made of love.
That's perfect segue to what I was going to bring up next, because this was literally my favorite part of the book, this idea that we don't have to master our anxiety or fears. We find peace by mastering love. So it's almost like the ego can keep doing what it's doing as we're developing that voice of listening to that voice of love and developing our connection with love. And as that gets stronger, then it's easier to choose it.
Yes. I'm so glad that you brought this up, because that's inspired by a course quote that attempting the mastery of fear is useless. It asserts the power of fear by the very assumption that it need be mastered, and that true resolution rests on mastery through love. So you just said it beautifully, that we don't have to master our anxiety. It can keep doing its thing. Corinne, my self-concept of Corinne is perhaps always going to be on the anxious side, but in learning that that's not who I am, that anxiety falls away, because my identity is literally shifting toward love. So that's this idea of mastering love, is that as we make that space for the voice of love, as we drop into our willingness in every given moment, we are literally having a change of identity from fear to love. And in the recognition of who we really are, in our identity of love, anxiety cannot exist. It has to fall away. Anxiety cannot exist in love. It's absolutely impossible. So we don't need to be concerned about the ego doing its thing. We can just say, there it goes again. But I'm going to come back to choosing my willingness. I'm going to come back to being willing to listen to that voice of love instead. And that's all we have to be concerned about. That's our little part.
Yeah. And also I appreciated when you said that fearing the ego is fueling the ego. So it's like, oh no, if the ego is saying this and we get scared, then that doesn't work. We just need to just choose love and be kind with ourselves.
Yeah. I love that. Literally, when we get frustrated at ourselves, if we get frustrated at the ego, if we tell ourselves, I should be more spiritually advanced than I am, that's literally just pouring gasoline onto the ego's fire. It's literally all just a form of self-judgment. And instead, if we can meet the ego's stuff with kindness, with love, with just, I see what you're doing and I'm going to choose again, then literally we're not giving it any fuel to keep burning.
And I think it's important you really focus on this, the book, that it's not also about just shutting down the ego and not listening to it. It's important to know what it's saying. So in the book you write, if we don't honestly acknowledge the dark spots in our own minds, they're not going to be transformed or healed. And then you go on to say that sanity lies not in having no angry thoughts, but having none that we should keep.
Yeah.
Which is great. So it's really, we have to be aware also and make room for what the ego's doing so we don't bypass it.
Right.
Like spiritual bypassing.
Yes. That's such a key word, because it's such a temptation to want to bypass, to just say, I'm going to give it all over to the voice of love. And that's fine. And that's wonderful if that works. But in my experience, I like thinking of river stones, a lot of those big stones all together. All of our ego gunk can hide, it likes to hide under there. So literally, as we get totally honest and totally radically honest and acknowledge our stuff as it comes up, it's like we're turning one stone over at a time, exposing the shadow underneath it, exposing it to the light. And that's, in my mind, that's the equivalent of getting honest and acknowledging what the ego is doing, looking at our fears with that voice of love in order to experience a miracle instead.
My one panic attack that I mentioned actually happened from that kind of spiritual bypassing, where it was when I was doing my skipping project and I was skipping a lot, and I was just like, the voice of love loves to skip. And I was just like, I don't care what my fears say. And I just kept pushing it away and just thinking and literally trying to skip past my fears. And then one morning I was giving a talk in Lima, Ohio to some at 8 a.m. to a sales team of mostly men. And I decided to start the talk by singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." I was just so full of myself. And they just looked at me like I was crazy. And all those fears that I had pushed down for so long just overwhelmed me. And I almost passed out. I had to sit down. I couldn't talk. So I really have firsthand experience of, if I would have been really looking at my fears that were coming up and why are they coming up and I'm going to choose this anyway, it would have been a different experience. But it like all came out at one time.
Oh, that's a beautiful example. That's a beautiful example of yeah, I love that, of bypassing and seeing what can happen.
Yeah.
I'm glad you got through that.
It's like if you don't look at it, it comes out in weird ways later. Weirder ways. It's already weird. And you say that even when we become very diligent at remembering to ask our inner therapist for help, if we don't know how to be quiet and listen, we're not going to receive the miracles that the miracle that's waiting to be recognized. So what role does meditation and mindfulness play in this?
That's a wonderful question. So just to throw out there real quick, that inner therapist is the term that I use in the book for that voice of love, because we all have this healing part of our own minds. Meditation is a big part, even if it lasts for 30 seconds. I'm not saying you need to meditate for a long time, but this practice of getting quiet, if you think about it, if we're constantly asking our inner therapist for a miracle, if we're constantly saying, help, 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 we're not leaving any mental white space. We're not leaving any area for the answer to come in. I learned this, that many Nobel laureates have their big ideas come to them in stillness, in the night, middle of the night. And it's the same way with this, that if we're constantly asking or saying, help me, and not getting quiet to listen, we're not going to be aware of the miracle that's waiting for us to acknowledge it. So even if we just, again, like going back to that one breath, if that's all we feel like we're capable of right now, just that one breath counts, and then slowly working up, maybe going to 10 breaths or 20 breaths. Counting breaths is a great tool to help us still our minds. One practice that I like doing is also keeping meditation informal, like using dishwashing as a meditation practice. So washing one dish at a time, just slowing down, doing nothing else, and just that. We can start really simple to bring in more space into our minds.
I call that making space for grace.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. That's perfect.
So we have about a minute left. So I would love, in just this last, time we have, if you could just offer some words of wisdom or encouragement for someone who's really up against the rails with anxiety right now.
I will offer you something that my stepdad actually said to me when I was knocked out on his couch from anxiety. I had dark circles under my eyes. It was hard for me to eat because my stomach was in a spasm. He looked at me, and I say this to you now: the light in you is too bright to fail. You are made of love, and nothing can stop you from owning that, from becoming aware of that, and from remembering your truth. All you have to do is be willing to do some work to begin to remember that. I wrote this book as this spiritual parent because I was lucky enough to have a mom and stepdad who shared this pathway. I wrote this book to be that spiritual parent for folks who might not be as lucky as I was to have parents who were spiritual. So the light in you is too bright to fail.
Oh, thank you so much, Corinne, for this book and for taking your experience and helping us all. For more information about Corinne Zupko and From Anxiety to Love, you can visit her online at FromAnxietyToLove.com. I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of New World Now.
Thank you for listening to New World Now with Kim Corbin from New World Library. New World Library publishes books and audios that inspire and challenge us to improve the quality of our lives and our world. For more information about their books and authors, you can visit them online at newworldlibrary.com.